The morning sun had barely broken over the dry, wind-bitten hills when James Callahan sat at his old wooden desk, the same one his late wife once used to balance ranch accounts. The ranch was quiet, too quiet, except for the rustle of the trees and the faint laughter of his sons playing somewhere out back. His rough, callous hands trembled slightly as he held the pen, not because he feared writing, but because of what he was about to ask. He dipped the pen in ink and began. I'm a widowed man with 2 boys who need more than I can give. I don't offer love or fine things, just shelter, food, and a name. If you're willing, come raise them. I can offer you honest work and safety. He paused. It felt cruel, transactional. But what else could he offer now? His heart had been buried with his wife 2 winters ago. What remained was a man too tired to hope and too stubborn to abandon his sons. Hundreds of miles away, in a grimy corner of a crowded city boarding house, Clara Evans opened a worn envelope with trembling fingers. The letter smelled faintly of dust and smoke, like the idea of the West itself. She read the words once, twice, and then held the paper to her chest. Life had been nothing but cold glances and harder choices since her parents passed. The factory floor where she worked offered no future. The landlord was circling like a vulture, and the streets offered only one kind of escape, one she wasn't willing to take. The idea of becoming someone's housekeeper, nanny, or even companion wasn't shameful anymore. It was survival. The fact that the man didn't speak of romance, only responsibility, somehow, that made it easier to say yes. 2 days later, Clara stood on the edge of the dusty town of Red Hollow, her modest suitcase at her feet. She wore her mother's brooch and her father's coat, too large but comforting. The train had left smoke in its wake, and now there was only silence until a wagon pulled up. The man who stepped down was taller than she imagined, with a hat that shadowed tired eyes and shoulders that bore more than just weight. James tipped his hat. "You Clara?" he asked, voice low and flat. She nodded. "Yes, sir." He motioned to the wagon without another word. Clara climbed up, settling herself next to a quiet little boy no older than 5. His older brother sat on the opposite side, watching her warily, arms crossed. No welcome, no smiles, just the creaking of wheels and the endless stretch of golden land ahead. As the wagon rolled through open plains and sparse trees, Clara kept her hands folded tight in her lap. The youngest boy sneezed. She instinctively reached into her bag and offered him a handkerchief. He took it without looking at her. That was enough. James stole a few glances at her. Simple dress, hands trembling slightly, but her chin held firm. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She just came. He respected that. They reached the ranch by sundown, a wide expanse of faded fences, sturdy barns, and a 2-story wooden house that looked weathered but strong. Chickens scattered as the wagon came to a stop. You'll sleep upstairs. Cook when you can. Boys, eat at dawn. Wood piles behind the house. James said curtly, lifting her suitcase as she climbed down. Clara simply nodded, her mouth dry. This wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty either. That night, as she lay in the small upstairs room with creaking floors and a single oil lamp, Clara stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the house, the boys' laughter echoed, then silence, then the lonely groan of the wind. She thought of the city, of everything she left behind, and how little of it actually mattered. She was scared, terrified, even, but for the first time in years, she wasn't trapped. She whispered into quiet. At least here, no one's waiting for me to fail. She closed her eyes, clutching her coat tightly, and let the stillness of the prairie carry her into sleep. The wagon wheels came to a slow halt in front of the weather-worn ranch house. Clara stepped down carefully, her boots stirring up the dry dust that covered the land like a second skin. The setting sun cast a burnt orange glow over everything. The barn, the broken fence, the silence. There were no flowers, no welcome signs, no warmth in the wind. James handed her suitcase without a word and gestured toward the house. She looked at him, tall, shadowed eyes, jaw tight as if carved from the same rock as the hills behind him. He didn't smile. He didn't scowl either. He just turned and walked toward the porch. She followed, heart pounding. Inside, the house was unexpectedly neat. The wooden floor creaked, but it was clean. The table was bare except for a single oil lamp. A fire crackled on the hearth, throwing flickering shadows across the room. It was warm, but not welcoming. Lived in, but lifeless. The two boys stood by the staircase, stiff and watchful. The younger one clutched a wooden toy horse. The older one stared straight at her, lips pressed into a hard line, as if daring her to try and take their mother's place. James's voice broke the silence. "This here's Tommy," he said, nodding to the younger boy. "And that's Will." The boys didn't say a word. Clara bent slightly and offered a soft smile. "Hello, boys." No reply, only a scuffling sound as Will turned and disappeared upstairs. James pointed to a narrow staircase at the back. "Your room's up there. First door on the right. Water's on the stove if you need to wash." She wanted to ask something, anything, but his tone didn't invite questions. Clara climbed the stairs slowly, her hand grazing the smooth wooden rail. The room was small but tidy. A narrow bed, a dresser, a window that looked out over a field of yellow grass. She set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed. Everything inside her wanted to cry, but she didn't. Not yet. Downstairs, she could hear muffled footsteps and the low murmur of James talking to boys. She couldn't make out the words. Maybe she didn't want to. She unpacked slowly, hanging her one good dress, placing her mother's brooch on the dresser. She took out the Bible, worn and cracked, and set it near the bed. Her fingers lingered on it. Night came quickly in the open land. Darkness pressed against the window like a living thing. Supper was quiet. She had cooked eggs, beans, and biscuits, simple and hot. The boys sat stiffly at the table, while James ate with his eyes down. No one thanked her, but no one complained either. Will watched every movement she made like a hawk. Tommy kept his head down, only sneaking small glances when he thought she wasn't looking. She tried small talk, asked about the horses, about school, but was met with silence. Eventually, James cleared his throat. "They ain't used to anyone new." "I understand," she replied quietly, folding her hands in her lap. Later, in her room, Clara lit a small candle and sat on the bed, staring out into the dark. Everything felt heavy. The silence, the stares, the pressure of being someone she wasn't sure she could be. She wasn't a mother. She wasn't even sure she was strong. She took off her boots slowly, fingers numb. She whispered to herself, voice almost too quiet to hear, "What have I done?" But even in her doubt, she didn't cry, because deep inside the fear was something else, something like a beginning. The morning sun had barely touched the edge of the hills when Clara stepped into the kitchen. The wooden floor was cold beneath her feet, and the silence of the house still hung thick like fog. She tied her apron tighter and began cracking eggs into the iron skillet. Outside, she could already hear the rooster crow and the creak of stable doors opening. James entered quietly, shirt sleeves rolled, hat in hand. He looked at her as if she were part of the furniture, something useful but unfamiliar. "We should talk," he said simply. They sat at the bare table. His hands were calloused, fingers drumming softly against the wood. "I didn't write for a wife," he began, eyes not meeting hers. "I wrote for a helper. For my boys." Clara nodded slowly, heart sinking even though she had expected this. "There won't be no courting, no expectations," he added. "You cook, clean, help with the boys. That's the arrangement. I offer you food, shelter, and wages." "And kindness?" she asked quietly. His mouth twitched, not a smile, not quite. "I'll try." By mid-morning, Clara had her sleeves rolled and hands deep in dishwater. She scrubbed pans that hadn't seen proper care in months, humming softly under her breath. She peeked out the window once. James was out in the field, chopping wood, back straight, movement sharp and focused. The boys were nearby, tossing pebbles and kicking dirt. She sighed. After dishes, she swept the floors, dusted shelves, and tried to find signs of the woman who once lived there. There were none. No sewing basket, no dried flowers, no letters. Only a single photograph above the mantel, a woman with soft eyes holding a baby. The frame was slightly dusty, but untouched. She left it that way. At lunch, she served stew and fresh bread. Will The older boy said nothing, spooning stew into his mouth mechanically. Tommy, the younger one, barely touched his food. "You don't like it?" she asked gently. He shrugged without looking up. "Mama made stew different." Clara nodded, her smile tight. "Maybe next time you can tell me how she made it." Neither boy responded. James said nothing either, just ate quickly and returned to the barn, like a man outrunning silence. The days passed in stiff routines. Clara woke before dawn, worked through pain in silence, and slept long after everyone else had gone to bed. She mended torn shirts, patched curtains, and tried to breathe softness into a home that had forgotten warmth. But the boys kept their distance, often ignored her entirely. Tommy sometimes lingered in the doorway while she worked, but scurried away if she spoke. One evening, she baked biscuits, added honey for sweetness. She placed one carefully on Tommy's plate and smiled. He stared at it, then at her and whispered, "We don't need you." Her heart cracked, but she simply said, "I know, but I'm still here." That night, alone in her room, memories came uninvited. A narrow cot in a cold shelter, her mother's hands trembling while buttoning up a threadbare coat. The day she'd been left behind at the train station by a man who promised marriage but vanished with her money. The years blurred together in a mix of hunger and hollow hope. She'd learned not to cry. Tears didn't bring food. They didn't bring safety. But tonight, her throat tightened as she lay under the quilt. Still, no tears came, just silence. But the next morning brought something unexpected. As she fluffed her pillow, something slipped from beneath it. A folded scrap of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a drawing. A clumsy crayon sketch. A small house with smoke rising from the chimney. A tall man, two boys and a woman in a blue dress, holding hands with the smallest child. Her hand flew to her mouth. In the corner, scrawled in blocky letters, "Tommy." She stared at the drawing for a long time, and for the first time since she arrived, she smiled. The wind howled through the gaps in the old ranch house, rattling window panes and whistling under the doors. The sky was an angry gray, heavy with clouds that threatened to burst. Rain slapped against the porch roof in wild sheets as thunder rolled over the land like distant cannon fire. Inside, Clara stirred a pot of soup while glancing anxiously at the shuttered windows. The boys sat near the fireplace, their shoulders stiff with unease. The storm had cut off the roads. There would be no town visits, no chores in the fields, only time trapped inside with strangers and silence. Will pretended to read a book, though his eyes rarely moved. Tommy hugged his knees tightly, flinching with every rumble of thunder. Clara noticed him glance toward the kitchen more than once, as if seeking reassurance but unsure how to ask for it. Then a crack of lightning split the sky. Too close this time. The house seemed to tremble. Tommy burst into tears. Without thinking, Clara rushed over, kneeling beside him. "Sure, sweetheart, it's all right. Just noise, just sky rumbling." He turned and buried his face in her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around him gently, rocking him as she would a child of her own. From the hallway, James stood quietly, leaning against the wall, arms folded. His eyes softened as he watched the scene. Clara's voice was low and soothing, her hands firm but kind. He hadn't seen anyone comfort his sons like that since. Since before, she looked up, meeting his gaze briefly. No words passed between them, but something unspoken shifted. Later, after the storm had dimmed to rain and the boys settled down with biscuits and milk, Clara hummed an old lullaby. It was a tune from her childhood, something her mother used to sing when the nights were hard and the stomach was empty. Will listened quietly, leaning against the wall. Tommy had curled up on a blanket and was fast asleep, head resting on Clara's lap. James was at the table, polishing an old horseshoe when the tune reached his ears. His hand slowed. The rhythm faltered. His gaze stayed low, but his jaw tensed. She noticed, when the lullaby ended, the room felt heavy with memory. She brushed Tommy's hair back gently and whispered, "He's a strong one." James cleared his throat. "Takes after his mother." The first time he'd spoken of her, Clara didn't press. She only nodded. After putting the boys to bed, She stepped into the kitchen and found James already there, leaning against the counter with 2 chipped mugs in his hands. He held one out to her. She blinked. Coffee? He nodded. She took it slowly, fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Warmth passed between them, not just from the mug. They stood there in silence, sipping quietly while the storm faded outside. It wasn't love. Not yet, but it was something. The first crack in the ice. The sun beat down on the dusty town road as their wagon rolled in slowly. Clara sat beside James on the bench seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. The 2 boys bounced in the back, excited at the chance to visit the general store. For them, it was an adventure. For her, it felt like entering enemy territory. The moment the townsfolk noticed the group, whispers began like the rustle of dry grass. Women by the well paused their conversation, eyes narrowing. Men leaned against hitching posts, murmuring just loud enough. "That's not his wife," someone said plainly. "Poor thing must have come for the money," another added. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. Her palms dampened with sweat, not from the sun, but from shame that clung to her like a second skin. She kept her head down, following the cowboy's long stride into the store. James didn't react. He kept his shoulders square, his eyes forward, and his pace calm, as if he hadn't heard a thing. Inside the store, Clara picked up flour and sugar, while the boys eagerly pointed at jars of candy. She smiled softly at their excitement, but it faded quickly when an older woman approached from behind. "Well," the woman said, her voice sharp as a rusted blade. "Didn't expect to see you again. Not with a man like him. Guess you finally found a roof, huh?" Clara froze. It was someone from her past, a neighbor's cousin or perhaps a church member from the days before everything had fallen apart. The woman's smile was fake, her tone laced with poison. Clara didn't respond. She only turned, set the sugar down, and walked out of the store with her chest tight and head lowered. The boys noticed her face when they stepped outside minutes later. She looked like someone who had just been struck, but refused to cry. Tommy tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Clara? You okay?" Before she could answer, Will turned to a group of nearby boys and shouted, "She's our family now. Don't talk bad about her." The boys blinked, then looked away awkwardly. James stepped out just in time to hear the tail end of it. He looked at Will, then at Clara, and did something unexpected. He walked over and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "They'll always talk," he said simply. "Let them." On the ride back, Clara sat straighter than before. She didn't cry. She didn't shrink. Instead, she looked around at the land, the sky, and then at the 2 boys who had stood up for her when she couldn't. Her lips lifted just slightly. That night, after supper, they all sat by the fire. James read aloud from an old book while the boys leaned against him, half asleep. Clara sat across from them, knitting quietly, then chuckled at one of the lines James read with an awkward cowboy accent. The boys looked up. "You laughed." She laughed again, covering her mouth, surprised by her own sound. Will grinned. "Do it again." Tommy added, "Yeah, you sound nicer when you laugh." Clara shook her head, still smiling. James looked up from the book, his eyes not cold this time. Warmth had found its way into that house. Not through the walls, not through the fire, but through hearts healing, one day at a time. Morning sunlight spilled to the kitchen window as Clara knelt beside the boys at the wooden table, guiding Will's hand over his letters. Tommy sat with a crayon gripped in his fist, tongue poking out in concentration. The once silent kitchen now echoed with small voices and patient corrections. Clara had turned a dusty corner of the ranch house into a learning nook. She found old books in the attic, stitched together pages, and even built a lesson chart with twine and leftover buttons. Slowly, the house was becoming more than a roof. It was becoming a classroom, a place to grow. Outside, she had begun tilling the hard, dry soil behind the barn. Just a few vegetables, she told herself. She planted beans, carrots, and wildflowers in the edges. Her hands blistered, but she smiled when tiny green shoots peeked through days later. She even placed a painted tin can on the porch rail to collect rainwater. One evening, as she struggled to carry a bundle of firewood into the house, James appeared beside her silently. He took the weight from her arms with one hand and opened the door with the other. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Not as strangers, not as contracts, but something gentler. He didn't speak much, but his actions did. He started leaving tools closer to her workspace, adjusted the barn door so she didn't struggle, and once fixed the steps she always tripped on without her even asking. Clara noticed. Every small act felt like a seed planted in frozen ground. One chilly morning, as Tommy woke up coughing, Clara placed a damp cloth on his forehead and gave him warm broth. She held him gently, brushing his hair back, and when he finally fell asleep in her lap, she kissed his forehead without thinking, like a mother would. James saw it from the doorway. He didn't interrupt, just stood there quietly, hat in hand. A strange tightness filled his chest. Not jealousy, not discomfort. Something else. A kind of longing. A kind of peace. Later that evening, while the boys played with hand-carved wooden animals by the fire, Clara sat beside James on the porch steps, sipping tea in silence. The stars stretched wide above them, and the crickets sang between pauses. Finally, he said, "They haven't smiled like this in months." He paused. "Neither have I." Clara didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him, her face soft in the moonlight, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. Sometimes, no reply is needed when hearts finally start speaking the same language. The day had started like any other. The boys were feeding the chickens. Clara was kneading bread in the kitchen, and James had ridden off to mend the south fence. The sun was warm, the wind calm, but peace rarely comes without a price. A distant voice outside made Clara pause. Through the lace-curtained window, she saw a man on horseback trotting up the path, dusty, grinning, with an all-too-familiar swagger. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Harold, the man who had once promised her a life of love, only to abandon her when her father's money vanished. Now, here he was, tipping his hat like nothing had happened. "Clara," he drawled, sliding down from his horse. "You got some nerve running off like that. Thought I might find you holed up somewhere, didn't expect it to be here." She stepped out onto the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her apron. "You have no right to be here." "Oh, don't be like that," he chuckled. "I heard about your new little arrangement. A widow's ranch, 2 boys, how cozy." His tone turned darker. "Wonder how long they'd let you stay if they knew who you really were." Her stomach twisted. Before she could speak, James returned. He saw the man and immediately stiffened. His eyes flicked to Clara, saw her pale face, and without asking anything, walked straight up to Harold. "You're not welcome here," James said, voice like steel. Harold scoffed. "Just a friendly visit. Your little cook forgot to mention she's got unfinished business." Without another word, James drew back his fist and struck Harold square across the jaw. The man stumbled back, stunned, then scrambled to his horse. "If you ever come back here," James warned, his voice low and lethal, "I'll bury you where the fence breaks." Clara stood frozen as Harold galloped away. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She turned slowly, walked into the house, and collapsed into the chair by the fireplace, hands trembling. The boys watched silently from the stairs. Tears slid down her cheeks. "I didn't ask for him. I didn't ask for any of this. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I kept quiet, I wouldn't ruin things again." James stepped inside, removed his hat, and knelt beside her. "You didn't ruin anything," he said firmly. "He's a ghost. You're the reason this place feels alive." She shook her head. "I'm just a burden, a problem that follows its own shadow." James reached for her hand. "You're not a burden," he said quietly. "You're the heart of this home." Her breath hitched at his words. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the stoic cowboy she met months ago, but a man who saw her, a man who cared, a man who fought for her, without question. That night, Clara tucked the boys in, her hands softer, her smile shakier, but real. Tommy grabbed her hand and whispered, "Are you okay now?" She nodded, brushing his hair back. "Yes, baby, I will be." Downstairs, James sat by the fire waiting. When she joined him, he didn't speak, just poured her a cup of tea. The silence between them was full, not empty. The wind outside howled, but inside the ranch house, something had shifted. Not just safety, trust, and perhaps the start of healing. The summer sun hung low over the ranch, casting golden light on the hills. Clara stood in the doorway, watching the boys chase each other through tall grass, laughter echoing like music. Her hands were dusted with flour. The scent of fresh bread filled the house she once tiptoed through as a stranger. Now it was her home. James approached from a barn, wiping sweat from his brow with a faded handkerchief. "Fence line held strong after last night's wind," he said, almost conversational. But there was something in his tone, a stillness, a tension. Clara raised a brow. "You sound like you're leading to something." "I am," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He gestured for her to follow. Curious, she walked beside him past the corral and the chicken coop, to a corner of the land she hadn't seen in a while. There, nestled between two oaks, stood a small, beautifully rebuilt cabin. Fresh wood, clean windows, flower boxes already planted. Clara's breath caught. "What is this?" James looked at her, nervous for the first time. "It's yours," he said. "Ours. I built it for you, so you could have your own space, your own say. Not out of debt, not duty. Out of respect. Out of love." She turned to him slowly, eyes glistening. "And here I thought cowboys didn't believe in fairy tales," she whispered. He chuckled softly. "I didn't, until a woman arrived, scared out her mind, and turned my house into a home." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden ring box. "It's not fancy," he said, "but it's real, and so's what I'm asking. Will you stay? Not as a woman who came here in fear, but as my partner, my equal, my wife by choice, not need." Clara looked down at the box, then back at James, the man who once barely spoke, who now offered his world without chains. She smiled, eyes fierce and playful. "Only if I still get to make the rules." He laughed, slipping the ring onto her finger. That night, they sat with the boys under the stars, fire crackling, marshmallows in hand. Tommy leaned against Clara, and Luke tossed a pine cone into flames. "Are we a real family now?" Luke asked. Clara looked at James, who was already watching her. "Yes," she said. "We've been one for a while." Days passed with the warmth of love blooming in small moments. Shared chores, quiet dinners, bedtime stories told with soft smiles. The ranch seemed brighter, fuller. The neighbors who once whispered began tipping their hats. The boys called her Ma without flinching. Even James, once a man made of stone in silence, would reach for her hand without hesitation. One golden afternoon, as the field shimmered and the wind blew gently through the grass, they saddled the horses and rode out. Clara, James, and the boys. The boys chased chickens and butterflies, racing ahead and laughing. James and Clara rode behind them, side by side. She looked around the hills, the barn, the trees now familiar, the land now loved. Once, she had arrived here terrified, a desperate woman with no voice, no place to belong. Now she rode proud, loved, healed. Final line. She arrived alone and scared, but found love, home, and the family she never dared dream of.